So that's how Mouse ruined comics.
Okay.
All right, 30 seconds, your 30 seconds of Run More Boomer music.
Stop right there, criminal scum.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is Wednesday. It is another episode. It is the 200th episode of the Mattriarchy. Can you believe I have been doing this for 200 episodes? You shouldn't. You shouldn't, because I haven't been here for all of it. This is a show where nobody has been here for all of the episodes, except possibly Evie in the chat, who I don't think she's here yet. She might come tonight. She may check on our reruns. She may be the only person who has seen all 200 episodes. And shockingly, not even all 200 are on this channel.
Huh.
Yeah, because a couple of times before I figured out how to share in the early days, and it was Matt McGibson did a couple of episodes when I couldn't make it on Carl's channel, I think, Carl Toon's channel. So there you go. There's the story of 200 episodes. But yeah, so tonight we are going to talk about, we're returning to the ages of comics. And we may be having some special guests. We may be dropping the link in the chat. Who knows what kind of crazy things we've got going on there. But before we get into that, I would like to take the time to introduce tonight's panel, including the ever-present technical genius and man of all trades, Metal.
Howdy, howdy.
We've got my old editor and comics guru, Hutch, Michael Hutchison. And we've got illustrator extraordinaire and one panel comic champion in Cartoonicus.
Who, me?
And, yeah, you. And we've got some other guy.
Oh, thanks.
Twitless back from vacation.
Blow.
So, Jim Tuner has given us told we should not do this. Wow, that is a loud slurp.
It was supposed to be. Jerk.
Okay.
I'm still sipping my drink at the beach.
I see. Jim Tuner said we should not do this. Review blankets instead. It's much safer, which is the best comment that I will not elaborate on in history of best
I'm never reviewing blankets again. I'm done. I've done it enough.
Yeah. Philip Cummings has said hello, everyone. For those of you who do not know, Philip Captain Cummings has been doing Bible readings over on his channel, and some of them quite good. Reading books of the Bible and talking about stuff. It's been I've checked out a couple of them, and I need to do more because get some more Bible in my life, I think. And Seven has given us an applause line, which I appreciate.
What's up?
So hey.
Yeah, when introducing Hutch, you actually forgot one of his titles.
Oh, did I?
He was also the man who killed the Silver Age.
That's right. I had forgotten about that. So let's get our timeline up and review it a little bit for those people who didn't catch it last time. We went through and we found this fancy little timeline app, and we're going through the history of American comics. I'm focusing in on the comic book industry, but we started with. Can we zoom in a little, because this is hard for me to look at?
Yeah, we could zoom in some. So,
I think we're focusing on superhero comics.
We have this line.
The before times.
We have the before times. So for that, just the before times.
Just the before times, which is awesome. We discussed
the plat, which I forgot to put the word age in there. Let me fix that. We have the plat age, which is old age. It's just things.
You're breaking up.
Prior to superhero.
Yeah. Oh, that's not just me? Okay.
It's some weird thing between me and StreamYard specifically. I don't know what it is.
So, well, anyway, so the Platinum Age of comics, which of course encompasses the proliferation, development, and the widespread popularity of newspaper strips and how they were foundational to the development of the superhero, even in some ways presaging the formal founding of the superhero genre with Action Comics #1, which kicks us into the Golden Age. Back in 39, right? I remember my dates right?
38.
38. Okay. 39 was Detective 27. That's what it was. I'm going to make my screen bigger just because it's hard to read all of this stuff. I should have got my bifocals. Okay.
Yeah, if I zoom in, all it does is it zooms into the timeline, but the words don't get any bigger.
Words don't get any bigger. Oh, that's so frustrating. Okay. We discussed the Golden Age of comics existing from 38, the introduction of Action Comics #1, up until 52, the year of the crash, which is a lot of people forget about. And something I was just talking about earlier today that I want to bring up again. I think we may have mentioned it last time, but it's important to remember that in 51, DC finally prevailed against Fawcett in their 6th or whatever law case, civil case, suing over the appearance of Captain Marvel. And that encouraged Fawcett to button up their entire comics wing and all their distribution and everything, which could not have helped that bubble burst any faster, I would imagine, in 52.
Well, I also want to point out that there's not an entire consensus here, because there was when it comes to Golden Age, when it comes to all of these ages, there are considerations regarding the financial ups and downs for them, or maybe the financial beginning and end to them. And then also whether or not you decide to base your aging system based on maybe a tonal or aesthetic shift. So one thing that Reese brought up last time was that if you are going off of sales, if you're going off of essentially the golden age of when they were super popular, then there is a crash, and you can clearly map out a sort of beginning and end time to that. But that there's another metric, another way of looking at it that pays a little the perspective shifts towards when do we see a aesthetic or tonal or other shift in the genre. So that's
which complicates things.
It's only like a year or two's difference, you know.
The thing is though is that even before like 51, before 52, you had superhero comics were already on the outs. Not entirely, but they were diminishing in popularity as crime comics, romance comics, and westerns were filling more and more space.
Horror too.
War 2, definitely War 2. So
I mean, sorry, horror. I meant
horror. Oh yeah, horror as well. Definitely. Yeah, I forget that. But yeah. So I don't think it's fair to eliminate the superheroes, because we still were having kids going to the newsstands to pick it up, whether they were getting, your Western books or your funny animals or your whatever, until they weren't so much because they just weren't moving off the shelves. So that's a factor, which is what my argument and why we finally stopped arguing and put 1952 on the paper last time.
And another member of the panel has joined us.
Oh, hey. Hello, Eglantine.
What's up?
So what are we talking about tonight?
We are talking about, we're recapping our conversation last time where we discussed the timeline of Western American comics, mainstream comics, and we were discussing the end of the Golden Age right now, as we're kind of just ramming through the timeline to get to the Bronze Age or whatever you want to call it.
Wait, you're ramming through the Silver Age to get to the Bronze?
Well, because we talked about the Silver Age, talked about the Gold Age and the Silver Age on the last show.
Yeah, we spent an entire show just to get to the end of the Silver Age. So we're trying to pick up.
So long as you spend a full hour on go-go checks. That's the most culturally significant thing DC Comics had to offer in the 1960s. But
we did not mention go-go jets at all.
Okay, so go-go checks. Marvel was kicking DC's butt all over the place as far as sales. People just loved Marvel Comics because they were offering something new. And I believe it was Weisinger who was saying, hey, look, it's a fad. It's not going to go anywhere. I'll show you. And they plastered go-go checks all over their books. So people know those are the DC comics. Those are the ones you go to. And what ended up happening anyway was people went, oh, okay, so we don't buy these? That's okay. Let's go to get the Marvel.
Oh, with the checkers patterns on them.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't realize. I knew they had gone with a line-wide branding, but I did not know why.
Yeah, that was the reason why they wanted. They figured they were getting lost in the mix, and they wanted to put up DC so everybody would realize these are the heroes you want to read. But it backfired, and it just marked as the books that weren't Marvel.
Well, and one of the interesting things about that dynamic too is I think I may have mentioned this on the last stream for those of you listening at home, but I saw an interview with Roy Thomas where he was talking about when he was working with Marvel in the late 60s and whatnot, and how they had one of the issues that they'd had was that DC was handling distribution through the National Publications wing was handling the distribution because of the collapse on stuff. And so part of why they were doubling up in superheroes. So you've got the thing with, Iron Man and the front half of the book and Thor or whatever was in the back half of the book was because they couldn't have, they had a limited number of titles that they could get distributed. 8.
They were only allowed 8.
And so to think that they were even with only selling a half a book, there are people that were coming for story 1 or coming for story 2.
And why not? You get 2 heroes in one book. I mean, you get Iron Man and Captain America. You get the Incredible Hulk and Giant Man, and then not Silver Surfer, but Submariner.
Right. Well, and I think that even I think it was past that period in time, and I don't have the number in front of me, but I remember in the early 80s seeing Marvel 2-in-1s, which were the same thing, but without the there wasn't the same necessary incentive from a production side, but just because that was something that was selling.
For the time, and this is, of course, Bronze Age, you had Marvel Team Up and Marvel 2-in-1, and then you had DC Comics Presents, and Batman had taken over Brave and the Bold around issues 74, 75. And they became great introductions to the universes. You like the Thing, he's teaming up with I'm trying to think of a Marvel hero, Black Panther. Okay, let's go try Black Panther. You love Batman. Well, here he's teaming up with Sergeant Rock. Maybe check out a Sergeant Rock comic if you like this story. They Marvel Team Up. Spider-Man did the same thing for all the Marvel comics, including, by the way, Saturday Night Live cast. But it was like it was a great way to introduce the other heroes, the other comics, so you could get to know the entirety of each universe through these books. Me and Eric are constantly praising those 4 titles for that reason.
Man, I absolutely loved when I first started going to comic shops. A little 11-year-old Reese discovered Brave and the Bold, and I was already into Batman, and that was sort of a thing. So the fact that you could check out Batman and Firestorm or Batman and Green Arrow or whatever, it was just like, man, it was like candy. And this was 1990, 1991, so a bunch of those you could get in the quarter bins for not much money.
Yeah. Now you can get them for $2 each at an auction every Saturday night on I Love Comics. I've had quite a few of those cross my path. They're awesome. I love. Let me get them out there, man. Let me get. I'm sure everybody will join. By the way, I was once accused of taking over every live stream I go on. Don't let me do that here.
Okay, well, I was just going to wrest control back from you to say, okay, so we discussed the Gold Age real quick. Silver Age, starting with the introduction of the Flash, is the most universal aspect of it. And as Twitless mentioned last week, it's largely agreed upon because of the tonal shift that the Flash had over even the Martian Manhunter, who was introduced earlier, I think a year earlier, but did not have that same Silver Agey feel that you got when you got Barry Allen, Hal Jordan, the New Hawks, all that kind of stuff. That was
Martian Manhunter could be folded into that whole sci-fi kick that was going on in the 50s. I think that's why he didn't have as much of an impact. I like the fact that you mentioned that. Also, speaking of sci-fi, Justice League wasn't the first Silver Age team. Legion of Superheroes, ladies and gentlemen, was before them.
Hey,
and
that is something I did not know.
Yeah, I may actually have to think about the Challenger of the Unknown, but I do know for a fact Legion of Superheroes was before Justice League.
Yeah.
What about is that including Justice League of America?
Yeah. They the Legion came out before the Brave and the Bold. I believe it's 28. Oh, you lousy kids! Your mic's muted.
Hutch, your mic's muted there.
I got it. Yeah. It was created by Otto Binder. Sorry, that's what I said.
Oh,
that's all.
Cool.
Yeah, the guy who was basically doing all the wonderful things with Shazam until Fawcett got shut down, and then he went to DC and did all the same kind of weirdness, and suddenly you have Brainiac and Battle City of Kandor and all that, and Legion of Superheroes is one of them. So. Yeah,
Otto Binder is one of those names not enough.
I was going to say, I thought that was Binder. Okay.
Binder. I don't know. I
did not know that. Thanks. It's Binder. Okay.
I think it's Binder. Yeah.
I always thought it was Binder until I was at a conference. I didn't go there. It was a virtual conference, but I was at a comics scholastics conference, and a guy came on to talk about Shazam and said Binder, Captain Marvel. And I was there to talk about Captain Marvel too. And the way he said it, I was like, it's a German name. I bet it is Binder. So I'm like,
go figure.
And so it sort of like opened something in the back of my head where it's like, this has to be how you say it.
Yeah. I could do 5 minutes on all of the names of people that I've mispronounced. It's Joe Staten, not Staten. I never knew that. And
I didn't either.
Yeah.
Is it Buscema or Bushima? That's one that always got me, and I'm
Mike Mignola. I always thought Mignola.
It's Mignola, right?
Yeah, it's Mignola.
Mignola.
Yeah. It's Italian.
Today I learned this.
So, and I only know it because I was talking to Doug Tenaple about it one time when he had me guest on his channel once. He was talking about Mignola, and I was like,
there's another one.
Yeah, well,
it's not Tenaple.
I always said, totally off subject, I always said Tenaple until my wife went through. She's a big Skull Monkeys fan, and she ripped all the audio tracks off the Skull Monkeys PlayStation game and made an album of it. And in the Worm Graveyard, there is a line where Doug sings "Doug Tenaple" in the voice of a worm.
Well, and I didn't feel so bad about getting Mike Mignola wrong, because even Ron, what's his name? The guy who played Hellboy.
Yeah.
I mean, I always thought it was Doug Tenaple. But that's because I can read.
What?
Wow, Twitless, you're still throwing that fire. I make one joke.
No, clearly he's wrong about his own name and heritage. It's 10 apples.
Oh, okay. That's what Marmaduke still calls him that.
Well, I don't think Doug corrects people, so that's probably part of it. Anyway, moving on.
Sorry, I've derailed it.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So Here we are. We're in the Silver Age. Flash kicks it off, and we picked. Of course, we have the Marvel enters the Silver Age. Hutch kills the Silver Age in 1971, if I remember right. What did we determine?
1970. March 1970, when I was born, is when it came. That was when Green Arrow. Was that when Green Arrow's nephew, the Green Arrow Green Lantern, comes out?
The road trip that they had.
Yeah.
Now something is occurring to me. If the Flash kicks off the Silver Age, can we be sure that he wasn't a Flash from the future who came back and changed the timeline?
We're not going to do this.
Yeah.
No. You take that flashpoint.
That actually, I think that's actually the event.
It was clearly Zoom.
Age, but we need
it's
to
always
on.
Zoom who's always at fault for that stuff anyway. It was me, Barry. So one thing I do want to point out is that according to some, there would be different ends to the Silver Age if we're going
Yes.
from the tonal thing. So like some books would go, okay, there's a clear, like, you know, Green Arrow and Green Lantern. It's like, okay, this is clearly where the shift is in this issue at this time. And some other books kind of maybe stay more Silver Agey for a little bit longer. And so the timeline isn't necessarily firm here. We can paint it and go, okay, here is, and I think it's fair to take something like Green Arrow and Green Lantern because it's such a, even if I don't like that comic,
Well,
it's still very important. Many people like point to that as this is a time of big shift, and it's fair to say that. But it's also fair to point out that this timeline, because we're dealing with so many different titles across at least 2 companies, if not more, and it's like, so it's not going to be a clean cut. I guess what I'm trying to say.
1973.
Yeah.
The death of Gwen Stacy.
The death of Gwen Stacy, and that's actually one of the things we talked about too, is that the death of Gwen Stacy, and I think the Bronze Age in some ways can be determined if you want to call it the Bronze Age, which I think is appropriate. We had some discussion about that, which I think is fine to bring up there, but whatever you call it, one of the things that I think that changed is that people started taking stakes real, and those idea of those street level heroes started getting some grit to them. You know, you have some of the events that happen. You got the death of Gwen Stacy. You've got the whole hard traveling heroes bit. You've got, you know, Batman's return to Dark Knight status. You've got the death of Iris West in the Flash. You've got the death of Aquababy, right? And those aren't kickoff events, but those are elements. And of course, a lot of those are from DC. The proliferation of the Punisher, the rebirth of the sword and sorcery genre within the big 2, and those kind of things that were all happening in the 70s through up until spoiler 85, right? so I think that there's definitely some argument to be had that the stakes being real may be what defined this Bronze Age.
Well, I wanted to jump in though, if I could. Hello, am I still here? Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to jump in and say that at this point is we should probably keep this brief, and we might want to run through the panel on the opinions here. But Golden and Silver Age are usually not too hard, even if you kind of draw the line a little bit differently. Someone's like, hey, Green Arrow, Green Lantern. One person says, death of Gwen Stacy. These are still very clear totems of what people tend to gravitate towards. And the age and the dates we're dealing with, even if you do one or the other, it's like, oh, I say 1971, you say 1973. We're still very close. It's not you can paint a little bit of a
split the difference,
or you could just make a continuum, like a kind of a range essentially. So we're not too far off. But once we hit post Golden and Silver, I think is where things get interesting, because post Golden and Silver, different people, depending on who you talk to, and I think this includes both scholars like the academics, and it includes the fans, the fan-cademics, and the industry as a whole. Because
sorry, I'd never heard anyone say fan-cademic. I love
well, that's
it.
the thing. No, that's the thing.
I believe it. It's a perfect. It's a perfect portmanteau. I love it.
But in addition to that, you actually, I pulled it up earlier. DC has its own timeline. Like if you go to DC Comics, they actually, they have their own, essentially date range that they deal with. And this is where things get kind of convoluted, because they all kind of, I think, have different, not just different date ranges, but like different ages, essentially. Some people will say bronze, iron, and then even after that, it just gets even more convoluted and out of whack. Some people just kind of are very broad. They say gold, silver, and then just kind of things got darker. I think it's what Grant Morrison essentially paints it as. He's kind of paints it a broad brush amongst like 3 large periods. He might add a 4th out at some point, because things have, it's been a while since he wrote Super Gods. But I think it's important for us to start unpacking what we see here, because not everyone's going to see it the same. They're not going to say, some people might not call it Bronze Age. They might call it something else, and they may have a very different understanding of what that is and how long it was. They might have a longer period, a shorter one. I think bronze and iron, depending on how you're painting it, often get lumped into one. And then after that, like I said, it's anyone's guess. So at this point, like I said, the conversation gets very interesting. And this is where I don't know if we'll reach nearly as much consensus as we do with Golden and Silver, which, like I said, we tend to fall within just a couple of years from some very, very clear signposts.
Well, and
I
was going to say, one of us is an academic, and the rest of us are just fans. So I think it's this is a good place to kind of have our discussion about what do we think about the term, because I definitely think there was an era here. Do we think that bronze is appropriate, and what defines that? And I'll go and pass
take
it to you.
offense to that. I shouldn't be in either category.
Before we do, I did want to, like you said, I'd kind of like to run down my basic idea of the time eras, and they welcome you guys to do it. But it's like, before we get into the minutia of arguing over every single little difference, I just have to say, first of all, I'm only a DC fan. I have no idea what's going in Marvel and all the time. So my limits are kind of only based on DC. And so if there's very clear defining factors that have to do with Marvel, I'm unaware of them. I'm just, it's not in, and I apologize for that being DC centric, but basically from 70 to 85 is the Bronze Age, because that's where, like we say, it starts with Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and runs till the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And then 86 onward is a very clear restart of Superman, a very, rethinking of Batman. They redo Wonder Woman. They start the new Justice League, the comedic Justice League that runs for 5 years. And at the same time, that's the Dark Knight, which later became called Dark Knight Returns when it was packaged up. And then Watchmen, and these things.
You froze, Hutch.
What?
You froze for a second.
Okay, sorry. I don't know if you lost me or anything.
Just after Watchmen.
Watchmen, Dark Knight, and basically all of this is a slightly more mature, basically
again,
teenagers and not at 8 to 12-year-olds.
Okay.
Well, I think it's obvious that Crisis is the end of, whether you want to call it the Bronze Age for DC, or in DC's own terms, you can call it the Dark Age or whatever. But as far as DC is concerned, post-Crisis is an era that lasts 25 years, and everybody understands it as much because, of course, it's from Crisis to New 52. Mm-hmm. But if you're encompassing the whole thing, the only term I've ever heard was copper for the 1980s, probably around 85 to about 95.
So if I could interject just a second, if you want to share my screen, Metal, what's interesting is that DC's own opinion of this is, let me see if I'll zoom in here, make that bigger. But they break it down. And like I said, this is a very purely, I think, commercial list. But they have a very vested interest in presenting it in their own terms. But they say Silver Age was 1956 to 71. They do use the term Bronze Age from 71 to 86. And then they break it down into Modern Age, which is 1986 to 2011. And after that, they basically start basing ages off their own their own product lines. Right. New 52 is an age. And then they do Rebirth.
Yeah, it's 5 years of mixed.
Yeah, Modern Age.
Yeah.
30 years ago.
Right. Yeah. But that's the official DC line as of now for what those ages are. Right. So it's just interesting because that adds another kind of a monkey wrench into the works, because this is what DC, the official line from DC, is regarding those date ranges. Right. And I'm sure, like I said, they're not going to line up with Marvel because they're going to line up with what they think they are.
This would have to be pointed out that this was created. This whole DCU thing was created about 5-6 years ago when we had Marvel or modern creators creating this website. I am 100% willing just to go, yeah, you're wrong.
No.
Sorry, I didn't bring it up to say that they were right. I brought it up to say that, like,
it's just one more thing to throw into the. I'm saying, you could throw it in the pile, but the one that's burning over there, why not?
I mean, I think it's interesting that the earlier you go, I think the more, again, consensus you get with it.
Well, yeah, I think that's the way it goes, is because whenever you have a bunch of ideas, usually. If left to their own devices, the cream rises to the top, right? And for the most part, I think comics, fan scholarship is amongst that where there isn't a lot of outside influence. It's just fans talking to fans talking to fans. And so I think you're going to have this sort of consensus mixing. And so the cream's going to rise. And I think the exception to those rules are some of those forgotten stories and forgotten creators that didn't have the money behind the press. Like the fact that DC hunted Fawcett to extinction and then cannibalized the corpse. People don't talk about that too much. But 100% happened.
Fizz says that modern DC writers would think everything before 2016 is the racist age. I'd say problematic age.
Yeah.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
What was the racist age? Oh, everything before
2016, right. It's the problematic times.
That's it. England teams had enough. Just
Not to throw another wrench into it all, but I'd like to talk about art for a second.
Yes.
Because with the 80s, I feel like we have another artistic revolution. Not that superhero costumes haven't already, I'm sharing something. Not that hero costumes haven't always had a bit of oddity to them, but in the 80s, they get experimental.
In what way?
Every way.
Well, I think more than 90s, but
I was gonna say 90s. Yeah.
90s. You
90s.
look at the Teen Titans; they're not more experimental than the outfits you had in the 70s over at Marvel that Wolfman was directing with on those kind of things. Anyway, if you look at the Tomb of Dracula, you look at the science fiction fantasy books, you look at flipping Conan and Red Sonja and even Dazzler and Cloak and Dagger. You have some of the same kind of elements that end their way up into the Teen Titans, use of different kinds of textures and fabrics. I think some of that actually flashes back to the Golden Age in their design too, because you had some of that same kind of stuff at Captain America's outfit and Aquaman's and Namor's. But I definitely think that the influence and the how comics sort of were coming into themselves again definitely led artists to have the freedom to get creative and because a lot, I mean, Teen Titans and X-Men were moving units, so people were seeing a lot of the creativity that had been bubbling beforehand. I do one thing that, now tell me, I might be wrong on this, but I know Longbow Hunters is a later story, but some of the more practical elements of superhero costumes, different kinds of batarangs that aren't just silly and stuff, those things started showing up a little earlier on before the Crisis, didn't they? Batmobile based on real vehicles and that kind of stuff. That was coming into vogue there in the early 80s. Am I remembering that right?
With Batman driving regular vehicles as Batmobiles, that was how it started.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 1970s, he kind of got an apartment. You see it in the Dark Knight movie. He kind of got an apartment. Is the Bat Cave, and
a
there
sports
were
car.
and there were some like that at that period. I do want to point out something. If you don't mind. Going back just a little bit, you brought up Fawcett, you brought up Captain Marvel. We know what happened. They sued them. They bought Fawcett. They let the copyright, the trademark lie. Marvel picks it up. But I do want to point out that we all know, no matter what happened, who the true Captain Marvel is. And I think we all agree and we understand.
Mm-hmm.
It's this dude right there.
Yes.
This is the one. He will have his day. He will have his fucking day. That's all I'm saying.
I was literally going to make a joke about that. I assumed you were talking about Billy, and I was going to throw that in there.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, this is. By the way, I did do a comic book origin on this character, and Eric Breen, he says, "You won't believe this." I said, "What?" And he goes, "Some jackass slabbed the split Captain Marvel." I went, I must have this. It is one of the worst comic books you could ever read.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. That's amazing. We'll have to do a review one of these days.
Say again?
So, I said we'll have to do a review one of these days.
Absolutely. Would love
All right,
Everybody knows is my
so
sweet spot for Captain Marvel.
So back to the quagmire we're gonna hit.
Yeah.
Regarding like basically what people see the ages, where they draw their lines, and like I said, how many of them, how long are they, and so on. Like I said, I think we're going to have some very interesting perspectives because there's different ways you can draw this. Like as Reese brought up before, you can draw this somewhat financially. You can date ages a little bit regarding that. You can do it regarding aesthetics. You can point to signposts that say this was a paradigm shift, like a Death of Gwen Stacy or something like that. And this, like I said, this is where especially now at this point where we're at past the Silver Age, this is where, like I said, consensus. I don't think we're going to quite hit it.
So,
Jim Turner keeps trying to get us on blankets. I will wrap a blanket around your head.
I know how the Legend of Zelda timeline hits a certain point and then splits into 3.
Okay, that's totally. I just reject that comment entirely. So one of the things.
No, I think he's got a point. I think at like 1980, we split into another timeline, and we're in the bad timeline of comics, and everybody else just continued going well.
I would go to the death of Captain America. We haven't seen Captain America since he got shot in the head, and everything went to shit after that.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that's definitely a factor.
But
and
also, as far as the ages are concerned, it was 16 years between 1938 and 1954 when we see the Flash, and so why not 1970s? You got the Green Arrow, Green Lantern. After that, 1986, you got the reboot or the post-crisis era. Then you get 2000. From there, it's the dark era. And then at 2013, it's the shit era. And it's,
oh my gosh.
Right, there you go. I'm sorry to make your video shorter, but have a good night, guys.
Twitless kind of cut me off before I ever got through all my other time periods. And 2011 onward is the era of crap. That's what I have written right there.
Well, it's consensus, I think.
There's no need to define 5 years of crap and then Rebirth is another era of crap. But it's just crap all the way.
Okay, but we're still not close to 2011. So
sorry.
See, oh my gosh.
Okay. I want to scroll it. I want to dial it down back just a little bit, right? Because I'm not going to say people are wrong, but one of the things that I think is worth pointing out, and we got, is that like if you look at how comics influence each other, the hard traveling heroes, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, ended something and it started something, right? But I don't think it came. If the idea of the Bronze Age or whatever you call it is an idea that hero stories start having stakes, I don't think we see that come to fruition until the death of Gwen Stacy, right? So there's like a transitional period, I think, before the Bronze Age so-called starts. One of the other interesting things that goes on is post 73, and correct my numbers if I'm remembering wrong here, DC started coming on really hard times, and you had the DC implosion and all that other kind of stuff because they weren't being able to compete until basically until the early 80s. I maybe even it was, I don't know if it was Superman the movie that got people buying DC comics again, but that's a possibility there. And O'Neill writing Batman and all that kind of stuff. But we have that Marvel really was pushing this idea of these Bronze Age ideals in their books that DC then played catch up to. And between New Teen Titans is probably the perfect example of that. Another one would be Oh Come On. It's a sword and sorcery book about a pilot who falls into the ocean and ends up in the world inside of the earth.
Warlord.
You mean the Warlord?
Thank you. Goodness sakes, I could not remember the name of it.
Oh.
With Mike
I had no idea that's what you were talking about.
What you're talking about, and you're talking about the implosion, Jeanette Kahn. Who knew doubling the price of a comic book? Hey, we're going to give a whole bunch of content y'all didn't care about the first time. We're going to reprint it and double price. Who knew that wouldn't work? But actually, the implosion made DC desperate, and Jeanette Kahn said, you know what, we're going to use all the rest of the money. Marvel, who wants to come over and play with us for tons more than you're making, plus more creative control? And they were able to steal away Marv Wolfman and, of course, Perez. And that's what got Teen Titans, Mike Grell for Legion and Warlord. And those were the ones that really pushed. Those were the headliners in the early 80s. It's hard to believe the Legion, who always gets rebooted at issue 67, no matter what, it seems like. But those were the ones that really led into DC becoming relevant. They were still getting their asses whipped. And then, of course, it was pointed out, look, it's just too damn confusing. And Marv Wolfman had the idea, let's destroy it. Mm-hmm. And Paul, I believe Levitz was Jeanette Kahn's right-hand man and was like, good idea, yo. So I'm paraphrasing.
Do you not like Crisis? Because I do.
I loved it. Are you kidding me? I've got it on my shelf. Okay. Who doesn't like Crisis? Do you know who doesn't like Crisis? Modern day writers. Because there's too many words and good pictures.
One of the things that about the Crisis that I heard, and I had never heard this because I started reading comics in about 1989, 1990, right? So I had only seen the post-crisis universe, and I felt like it was really organic, and I felt, able to connect to the characters and their story arcs and everything else really well. And the letter columns were so alive back then that anything I didn't know, and also hints that send me to the shop looking for the other forgotten gem were all in the letter columns. That it wasn't until I started writing for Fanzine and checking out the Fanzine boards, that I ran into some older fans who didn't like the Crisis because some of their favorite stories had been undone, like the Hawkman stories, of the how the Thangarian stories played out, because that was not necessarily well implemented after the Crisis. Right. Or people that were just like, oh, Barry Allen got done dirty, and I'm like, did he? It seemed like a super.
So I don't want to derail things, but I feel like I'm putting them back on rails. I wanted to hear from. I think we should hear from the rest of the panel, because we had Hutch and Engelstein, who are our old bald guys who are. I'm just kidding.
Wear it like a crown, man.
We have a consensus. We have a consensus there. But
we're bald.
But I think
the Bronze Age.
But maybe that too. Well, actually, we could add metal to that consensus. Like, you all have like a Lex Luthor aesthetic going on there. Maybe from the rest of the panel, kind of where you broadly see the periods, and then we can kind of like take the discussion from there. See how much of a consensus we have, I guess, or lack of one. Although we've got a couple. Cartoonicus, Reese, Metal, and me, I think, need to kind of weigh in and say, here's kind of what we see in terms of what those timeline patterns are. So I guess we should poll the room, and then we can discuss.
I would like to finish mine too.
Oh, you? Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. You had more. Okay.
Well, yeah, you cut me off, and I got as far as Crisis, and that was it. So
I didn't. What are you thinking about it?
And then after that, I said that things got. Basically I was starting to say that things got more mature, and yeah, you could basically say that everything from 85 onward is just DC era, modern era or something. But there are some very because right around the time that Image came out and made everything much more darker, so people tend to talk about a dark age, but I think that's kind of along the same lines of everything getting made for teenagers instead of 8 to 12-year-olds. And so it's kind of along those lines. And then I would say maybe the defining thing is when they changed and got rid of the Comics Code Authority around 2003, 2004. Because then the next thing they do is, you remember how Watchmen was like marked for mature readers, and there's maybe a couple S words and then this rape scene that is hardly graphic at all. And as soon as they get rid of the Comics Code Authority, Sue Dibney, a character who hasn't even done more than share a chaste kiss with her own husband, is being raped doggy style on the Justice League table right over, Barry's chair. And so it's like that. Now it's really not made for anybody but adults. They say teenagers, but that's kind of, it marks a very it's a very hard change, because that's basically the Dan DDO transition right around then, and DC really does become much meaner, to the point that, Deadpool is joking about how Marvel is so much more lighthearted than DC, and it's like DC's the universe that had like smiling characters and all their promotional stuff. And it's like they change it so much more from 2000s onwards that it really is. You could just say the Dan DiDio era from then on, basically. And yeah, I could go through and put like 5-year chunks of, here's how things changed in the late 90s, because they did. There was a real renaissance for about 5 years, and then it kind of changes again, and then it changes again. There's very, but yeah, you'd be chunking up little tiny things. So basically, that's my divider, is that the Dan DiDio era, and then 2011 onward is the Age of Crap.
So, Age of Crap. Okay.
Age of Crap.
Does anyone else feel that, like, at a certain point, Teen Titans got strangely more dark and more adult than even the rest of the adult characters?
Once they went Baxter.
Yeah.
When they went to the Baxter series, and you're hitting around in the 50s and up as far as the regular series is, before they went to Tales, I think that's really when they kind of turned. And why not? They did the first 5 issues of the Baxter series is where they fought Trigan, and that was a big success for them. Yeah, nowadays you can find them in any dollar book, all dog-eared. But seriously, they were told that's the way to go. Batman, look what happened with Batman. Batman was dark, but it went Frank Miller dark.
We want to hear from Metal. Did you want to weigh in on this before we go to Reese?
I just wanted to know specifically why we're jumping so far ahead when we haven't even gotten our dates down for the Bronze Age yet.
Well, the reason why is because like different people someone might not even say Bronze Age at all. So we want to get like a kind of a poll of like, poll the room. Where do you see things broadly, and then we can kind of narrow down after we kind of get the temperature of what everyone's seeing.
I guess broadly, I'm fine with the death of Gwen Stacy being one of the transition points, Crisis being another one. Probably after that, I would say it's mostly the same until Civil War, and then everything's crap after that. That's pretty much the way I see it. Yep. So I might be adding the crap a few years earlier than you guys are.
Well, and I would also agree. I think that the Crisis and Secret Wars were both big elements in their respective companies, and the idea of the introduction of the black suit and Peter and Mary Jane's wedding in the late 80s as well were kind of transitional to how that universe played out. But like there was something with Spider-Man. Spider-Man had a decade of stories, and then the Clone Saga kind of put Spider-Man into a holding pattern that I don't think he's ever gotten out of. And it's almost like the editors and creators became afraid to they spent 30 years watching Peter grow up, and then they became terrified of what an adult would be. So they kept evolving him in that. And I think that's something we started seeing happen in the X-Men as well. And I think that started happening from just before the Age of Apocalypse until Grant Morrison destroyed the X-Men. So there was a lot of weird hiccuping and ruination in like half of the Marvel books. Meanwhile, like the stuff they're doing with Captain America was great. I loved Daredevil at that time period. Wolverine's solo title I thought was amazing. And then up until Civil War. And then I think Marvel died at Civil War. I've never come back from that. I think there's been a few titles here and there, but that have been worth reading. But so much of it just couldn't ever tick over to anything broadly heroic. And I think every time you'd have a chance to have, and I will probably talk about this later, every time you had a chance to have a heroic uprising, it just got killed on the vine, either through low sales or through edginess. But as to over with DC, I do think that the Identity Crisis killed killed it was a nail in the coffin that was the DC universe, the post-crisis DC universe. And I think some of that actually started with Kingdom Come, but it didn't really reach fruition until
everybody mark Kingdom Come on your bingo cards. It's been mentioned today.
The misunderstood lessons of Kingdom Come were embraced in Identity Crisis, and then it was just spiraling event into a dissolution that was the New 52. So,
are we really gonna skip over the elephant in the room here?
Which one?
A little guy named Bob Liefeld?
No, I don't think Bob Liefeld was that impactful.
No. Okay, well, actually, okay. So I want to. So that's a good transition. I'll jump in and say how my patterns. I have trouble with the official ages. The signposts for me are, I think, a little bit different. I think that you see some very strong shifts happening at certain points. Obviously, I agree with Eglinton regarding a Death of Gwen Stacy. I think it's, again, a very important shift for a lot of people. I think another important, really big signpost that hasn't been mentioned a lot today, but I think a lot of us would agree with, would be Marvel's Secret War as a huge shift towards superhero storytelling, because it was kind of like the huge big crossover event that basically spawned 1,000 more crossover events. So I think that, putting, I don't know if it's not an age necessarily, but it definitely heralded an age that we currently still deal with, which Marvel plans however many crossover events per year. That's kind of how they schedule their books.
Okay, I want to redact everything went to shit after Secret War.
I like Secret War. But anyway, so we have shifts like that, right? I think that another huge shift happens in 1986 when you have Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns happening. 1986, the year I was born. I definitely, if Hutch killed the Silver Age, I killed something else. So we have a big shift there. I think another couple of shifts that I think are very important. And again, I don't know exactly what I would call them, but again, these are the big kind of like signposts for me. The image revolution, they call it that for a reason, and I think it's an important also shift. It's a shift in on many levels. It's a shift in how the comics are kind of produced, sold, how they market themselves, how they present themselves. There's these aesthetic shifts when you have McFarlane and Liefeld and company who have these huge splash pages that storytelling is done in. Ethan Van Sciver, I think, also kind of is part of that whole kind of like image kind of wave, essentially, or people image like, essentially, where you have these like I said, you have double page splashes essentially being the vehicle by which superhero stories are told. And so it's not just a storyline shift. There is an aesthetic one as well, where you see these very large pieces of art that are essentially they're pinup pieces of art that are supposedly carrying the story, and it plays differently. There's a shift there. I think then there's another shift in the 2000s, and you can clearly tell a 2000s comic. And even bigger than that is, I think, a tonal shift that happens after 9/11. I think 9/11.
Yeah,
killed.
I was hovering that too. I was
gonna
that on there. Yeah.
If Civil War killed superheroes in a lot of ways,
on this.
Yeah, okay. If superheroes killed, if 9/11, if Civil War is largely, and One More Day and all these things that we talk about as being utterly ruinous to a lot of comics, it's 9/11 that causes Civil War. It's 9/11 that ends up causing One More Day. And there's this huge trauma that gets wreaked upon New York. And then the creators in New York basically put superheroes through trauma and therapy to work out their own trauma from that terrorist attack. And so there's a clear shift there. And then
that's still going on.
Yeah.
The only reason Tom King has ever been paid money for comics is because that's all he does.
Yeah. And I think there's an intensifier of that around it's post 2012. So I think a lot of people put it around 2014, 2015 or so. And there's an intensifier of that. And there's another clear aesthetic and tonal shift. So those are, to me, I'm less about the labels, and I'm more about, we see these very clear aesthetic and stylistic shifts happening at these times. So
and that's why I'm bringing up people like Liefeld here, who not only created a new art style, but with that came right. With that came a feel. Right, you talk about that edginess.
Yeah. The pushback that I would have to that whole framework, not to interrupt too much, is that the use of double page spreads and all that kind of stuff, that was thoroughly present in. It was interspersed, but it was thoroughly present within Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Not in the same 90s way.
Well, it's because you don't have the hyperviolence that the Image guys bent on. So that is a reflection of I feel like even everything about even Mark Silvestri's art style is bent upon hyperviolence.
Correct me if I'm wrong though, because like one of the images that I have in my head, the images I have are not violent. They are, however, complete splash. Like as in 2 pages, one image of Spider-Man swinging across the city. It's very clear.
I'm talking even about the way I'm talking about even the way the lines and shadows are being used are violent. So like you have with Perez and with his ilk, you have a draftsman's hand on it, right? Whereas with the Image guys, it's evocative, it's violent, it's expressionistic.
Yeah, I don't know if
Brayfoggle's pencils were the same.
Aggressive, I'd be fine with that. I don't know violent.
No, I'm using violent in a Victorian sense.
Mm-hmm.
I like.
Yeah, I've got a perfect example here if you want to put it up.
Anyway, so I'm not saying that everyone's going to agree with me. I'm just saying that that's kind of how I see it.
Because it's like, look at these guys. These are not superheroes anymore. This is a back alley gang.
No, they're
posing as superheroes, right? This is, hey, bad guys, not just we're going to fight you. Check out how awesome we are as we're going to fight you, right?
So the point I
don't think that's separated from the superhero ethos at all.
I agree with Reese, but the point I want to make here,
that would make early Teen Titans just a gang.
The point I want to make, though.
Well, that's why I was asking, and how long does that?
I'm talking about Bob Haney Teen Titans.
So the point that I agree with Cartoonicus about is the fact that I feel like pre that kind of Image revolution and McFarlane and all the rest of them, even in a double page spread, you'd still be doing quite a lot of storytelling. Like there's a lean towards, even if it's a single image, but in that Image revolution just brought, it's like pinup art that's meant to like tell a story, but it's very clearly pinup art. Like there's that shift towards single image, single moment, double page spread, or single page splash, and we're leaning into the image, and the storytelling kind of happens as it radiates outside of the image as opposed to the other way around, where I think in earlier ages the story carried the art more. The story was more king, whereas post Image revolution the image just started to become more predominant.
Well, there were arguments around that time. It was because people like myself who are more into story and see that as the most important part of the comic would say, but it's the art that gets you in. My whole thing, but the story keeps you there. And for that period, the writers lost, the readers lost. People who, and by that I mean people who prefer story over art. And I don't mean put in bad art. Riley Rosmo, he shouldn't be in comics, but I think that needs to be on a T-shirt somewhere. The point being is that the focus, it kind of shifted slowly from when you have the question, what's more important to comics, the art or the writing? People would go, well, it is a visual medium, so the writing is very important but the art is most important. It would shift, and by the time Image came along, it really was argued that the art is important. Writing doesn't matter so long as we got great art. And so if you read any, and I know people give Eric Larson a freaking pass for Savage Dragon, go back and read that crap. Give any of them a try. The writing is horrible.
Would you say that to Spawn #1, early Spawn as well?
Because I would say it's it's poor. It's bad. I don't know if I would call it horrible, because there were some decent things about it. But I haven't read Spawn as recently as I have the Eric Larson Dragon.
I feel like you could make an argument for early Spawn being pretty strong.
Well, I think there's a very good reason, I think, why McFarlane early on started getting on co-writers, because maybe his first or second issue, and then he started having problems with it. And I think there are and I have not read a lot of Spawn. I've just read bits here and there. But
because I presented Spawn 1 through 3, and I presented to 2 classrooms of students, and I presented to them that the criticism of Image, including, like I said, scholars who particularly call out the Image writing for being terrible, and I've said, is this fair? I've had 2 classrooms come to the consensus, no, this writing is actually very solid.
I'll check through them. I'll see if you're right.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I just think it's very interesting.
That actually sounds like an excellent show.
I like Spawn.
Yeah. What were you saying, Maurice?
I said that sounds like an excellent show. Is let's all read Spawn till it's bad, and then
see where everyone quit
until it's good.
Because that's what I've heard. I heard that it started strong, and then it got weak, and then McFarlane says, "Wait a second, I know people," and then he gets
Neil Gaiman
on, and he gets 2 other guys.
That was issues. That was like issue what, 9, 10, 11, around there.
I think so. It was pretty early.
So he understood those first 8 issues weren't great writing. Not saying they weren't great comics, because Todd McFarlane had some really cool art, and it wasn't a bad story. I think it was actually a good story with the soldier who gets betrayed. He becomes an agent.
His layout work is extremely good.
Yeah, and I think the outline of the story was pretty good. I just don't think that the writing was strong enough, and that's one of the reasons why you get Neil Gaiman and Dave Sims and Alan Moore writing on it. So, but once again, Rob Liefeld, pinup art, sure, fine. Writing was crap. Eric Larson, Savage Dragon was fun for the day. I went back and read it, and the dialogue, and it's bad. Great idea. I love the idea of superhero cops. Shadowhawk was Batman without the Batman. I don't know.
Oh, he's got a cool design, though. I do like Shadowhawk's.
Yeah, that is true. And I love the covers.
The question is, did Rob Liefeld influence other comic artists and writers enough to create?
It's not just Rob. It's that Image. You got to lump Rob in with the other Image guys. It's not just Rob. Rob is part of, and he's an important part, right? But you have him, McFarlane, Lee, and others.
So let's step back just a little bit. Okay, let's pin down the end of the Silver Age. I think, do we all agree? 85, 86. You got the Secret Wars. You've got
Bronze Age.
Crisis on Infinite Earth. End of the Bronze Age. Sorry.
Crisis.
Yeah. And also, Secret Wars was just before that. Right?
Yeah, they came around the same point.
Around the same time.
So, yeah,
you got
85,
the Dark Knight. You've got the Watchmen, all that kind of stuff. 86 is the end of the Bronze Age. We agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If we're using the term Bronze Age, I'm okay with
Restarting with Stacy? What year are we starting with?
Yeah, let's start with Stacy in 73.
73.
Okay. Let me start there.
It's not the Hard Traveling Heroes the month I was born? Okay.
Yep.
I thought I killed the Silver Age, which would start the Bronze Age, wouldn't it? Or
my recommendation is we have some gap time as the Bronze Age was really finding its feet.
Okay.
Okay, and then we're going to 86.
That gives us plenty of room for people to feel, like there's something going on in there. I've got some fun stuff in the chat. Seven says Wildcats was cool, and people forget that Rob Liefeld was basically a kid, which is true. True. Mm-hmm. It's also really interesting finding out about what he was trying to do business savvy and trying to make money in all of that. And bringing on other artists and creatives and writers to give space to when he was trying to make it all work. So I think that's really interesting to find out about how to learn more about how Image started and how everybody screwed everybody else over. It was a giant mess. It was a giant mess.
So the other reason I like bringing up the Image revolution is that it helps us get out of just thinking about the big two, because Image was a very important movement and it's not big two.
Right.
And it also helps us sneak in another comic book company that doesn't get talked enough about, Valiant, right?
But one of the reasons that I think it's important to bring it up here is because you wouldn't have an Image revolution if it wasn't for the big two. I mean,
that's fair. That's fine.
It was them becoming disgruntled with Marvel in the era after Secret Wars. So you have all these same kind of ideas, and so many of the ideas that they were playing with in the Image sphere. And I want to go to you on Valiant because you're definitely more of an expert on that than I am. But a lot of the ideas they were playing with in Image were the same kind of deconstruction, hyper-violent ideas that were spinning out of misreading Dark Knight Returns and misreading Watchmen. The proponents of the anti-hero as the high watermark of superhero comics. And that's what every Image book was a deconstruction of a lame copy of a DC or Marvel hero.
Well, one thing, go ahead.
I was about to say that's why I think this is a good. You could call this the Dark Era. I know some people would call it the Copper.
I've heard people say Iron as well.
I prefer Pockets.
Pockets.
Pocket era.
I've never heard anything other than bronze, silver, and our gold and silver, bronze, and copper
era.
But yeah, but it all folds in. But then again, I think 2000s really is Dark Era. But yeah, no matter what you would call this era, what you're talking about just kind of folds into it because, like you said, it is just derivatives. It's the wrong lessons learned by better stories. I mean, heck, you see it in music. You get NWA and you get not Pearl Jam. What are the Come As You Are, Nirvana. And after that, everybody's just is a pale copy in the 90s trying to reproduce, and it's the same thing. And then, I mean, granted, you did get your bright spots. You got Bone in the 90s. You got the majority of the Sandman in the 90s. I did a whole video on it.
Starman.
Starman, yeah.
James Robinson's freaking awesome story. So
that leaves the question. Did the 90s start off a new era, or is the 90s an era of its own?
I think it's just pocketed in.
Yeah.
What I was saying about there being sub eras, it's like you could easily make an argument that the whole thing from 86 up till 2004 is one era, but I really do think there was kind of a renaissance after the whole Image, the dark stuff where, remember how Justice League, the 5 years of Keith Giffen and all that fell apart and it was just awful, and there was the Extreme Justice and everything else. The late 90s is when you had the new JLA started up again. You had Kingdom Come, which I know we've had a lot of disagreements about that, but I would say this is almost an age of nostalgia. Mm-hmm. It's a renaissance of nostalgia where it's like there's a fondness for the old Silver Age characters. This is when you have the what's so funny about Truth, Justice, and the American Way, and the there's the other bright spot from right around that time is CrossGen, and it ended 2004, the same time that everything is going bad at DC. So it's like 2004 really is a hard cut to like the end of everything good.
And I'd like to spend some time talking about those bright spots at DC and a couple of titles at Marvel, because this is when I was really I was first on my own and I had that extra scratch to spend, right? But before we get into that, I want to give the floor to Twitless to talk about Valiant, because I know he's passionate about it, and I think it has something really important to say about comics in the early 90s.
Yeah, I was going to say, one issue I have when we start getting into labeling the ages is someone will say, is we get into this, I think it's a bit of a trap. And it makes sense if we say, oh, this was the dark time for DC, or a dark time for Marvel, or Image was kind of edgy, which I can't argue with. But if we label all of that the dark times, or like the dark ages, right? Then we miss out on like, hey, well, if you really liked Valiant, this was like their golden age. Like, you know what I mean? Like the 90s is where, like, if you really liked Valiant and you really liked the sort of interconnected universe that he created, which is essentially the MCU before the MCU was invented, where every comic was completely coordinated with everything else, to the T, and people really bought into it. All these characters sharing a shared universe, and everything being like meticulously plotted out. Like I said, the 90s was, where it was at for Valiant, and Valiant is an important, a small but an important moment in the ages of comics. And so just lumping them all in terms of the dark age, I think is kind of I think it does an injustice. I think it's a bit of a trap if we're labeling the entire genre in those ages. So that's
Right.
where
And
I
here's-
start. That's where I start to
so
have
here we get
problems
back-
with labeling.
Here we get to the Zelda thing that I was going to throw off
Right,
here. But
and that's why I was ultimately asking that question.
It's worth mentioning here. But I want to point out one of the things that you have here with Valiant was Jim Shooter,
Mhm.
and what Jim Shooter was trying to do in the 80s, right? And with the Secret Wars that we've already talked about, and how that changed the way Marvel had it. The creatives at Marvel wouldn't tolerate that type of coordination. They wanted to be solos, and they became Image. And they rejected Shooterism. And then Shooter says, fine, I'll go make my own universe. And he did. And
Yep.
people and a small group of people really, really loved it. Right.
Yeah.
And I say small in comparison because they weren't able to keep their doors open long term. And there was
It's
lots
small for then. It would be
Listen.
considered a huge hit
It was the
today
true
if
golden
it had the
age.
same numbers.
Yeah.
And it was the true
and so-
golden age because we had the Nintendo comic system. So
There's metal, yeah.
But you're
Yeah,
making
actually-
an argument. Actually, you're kind of making an argument for you can't talk about the feel of the books. Like you said, you have. I haven't even been able to map out Twitless's idea of what a timeline for all the comics would be because it seems incredibly personal. We would have the Crisis, but 7 years later, you cut that age off because Valiant. But wait, Image was 2 years before that, so you have the next stage being from Crisis to Image, and then you have from Image to Valiant.
I'm okay with saying something like
But
I'm okay with the signposts. I think the issue I have is the labeling, right? So I would, instead of calling it the Dark Age, I'd want to call
I
it.
mentioned Copper, and then the Dark Age really comes in the 2000s, and that might be, like you said, because of 9/11.
Mhm.
That everything went dark. Everything, not just dark as in the tone of the comics went down, but the perception of comics went dark as well. Nobody seemed to be, and I'm talking writers, readers, whatever. Nobody seemed to be content with the titles that they had. You had crisis and event after crisis and event in the 2000s. There was no. Now we're kind of getting that as we are right here, and it was absolute higgledy-piggledy. There was nothing people to grasp onto. So in the 2000s, and I'm not saying all the stories were horrible, it's just it really did seem like everything was being dumped into a black hole.
So
And yeah,
I've got one more pushback against Copper, and it's this. It's
Okay.
a minor point, but the reason why I like the signpost rather than like signposts of shifts rather than like the labeling it like gold, silver, copper, and so on is that Valiant then its entire run gets labeled Copper Age, and I'm like, I feel like it basically puts something like Valiant, which people were very passionate about and would put next to the greatest comics that you could make, and it makes it be like, it's Copper. You know what I mean? It's an optic thing, but it is an issue that I have because an entire company's best output gets then lumped into like the worst metal in comparison to rarity of
Well,
metals.
it happens with a lot of them. I will put I would put First in there. I'd put Now in there. I understand that Valiant was bigger because Jim Shooter made it bigger, but there's a lot of companies that came and went in the 1980s that deserve to be pointed out. Chuck Dixon kept one independent company by himself going for a while. But I've got another suggestion.
Okay.
Got another suggestion. Maybe don't call it the Bronze. What would it be? 1974, 75, all the way up to say 93 when he was kicked out. I think it was 93. I could be wrong. And we call it the Claremont Age because everybody was living under that when they were in the 80s.
I think that's definitely
a fair argument.
That's definitely a consideration in terms, especially in terms of looking at the sales magnitude that was Claremont. But I don't necessarily think that everyone's books were trying to do the same thing Claremont was doing.
No, I was being facetious.
But well, yeah, no, it's worth noting. I mean, it's just like
Claremont's
thinking
point.
about how phenomenal how foundational Jim Shooter was to the Marvel Universe and his dedication to getting things done on time, and how that had to do there. I think that's worth. I mean, that whole concept of work ethic that Shooter had is something. One of the things I want to go ahead and put into the mix, and I interrupted somebody here. I don't know who it was, but one of the things I think we see, because also Neostar in the chat mentioned Malibu Comics, and Malibu had a lot of the same kind of big imagery that Image had, but a lot of their stories, they were shooting for classical hero stories and everything. I am wondering if what we're actually seeing here is two competing visions of what heroism is supposed to be, right? If two ideas about how comics are supposed to tell those stories, these two competing visions, the Image model and the Valiant model of and because a lot of DC's best books were in that same vein, the Image that Valiant was going for, right? Where they were trying to tell stories, they were hearkening back to the older era, they were embracing continuity, there was tight-knit storytelling. Denny O'Neil ran his house under the same kind of ways there, right? So and even Superman with John Byrne's Superman, it was a new vision of it, but it was still trying to capture the best of what made superhero stories in the past, and they were that aspirational aspect. But the very worst DC stories were those that were of the same vein as the Image books, right? People trying to take Lobo seriously, or when they were trying to make Jonah Hex relevant by making him a sci-fi hero.
Hex.
And
Extreme Justice.
Yeah, Extreme Justice. Where like you have DC and you have Marvel, and some of their writers are going the Valiant route, and some of their writers are going the Image route, right? But those are the two. Even though in the late 90s, DC kind of doubled down on the Valiant route, and were telling complicated, involved stories that were showed in realistic stakes and character interactions, and had aspirational heroes and all that kind of stuff. I loved it. But you had a couple of Marvel books that were doing that too. Captain America was in that same vein, unlike what the X-Men were turning into, especially after the Claremont left. So
could I raise one other point that's like completely beyond what we're talking about?
Probably.
Also, the 1980s was the rise of collectability, of popularity of comics, and the independent market, which brought about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the Tick. We haven't even mentioned those, and all those other companies that are beyond the ones we've been talking about. And so yeah, it's really hard to just, like you say, if you just call it a base metal, because it's not as good as Silver Age. It's like, in many ways, this was a Renaissance age, sort of.
I don't think it's being seen, and when people call it this Silver Age or in Bronze Age, you're not talking like Platinum Age isn't considered the greatest age of comics, even though that's considered the most valuable metal of them. It's just that's what it is. So Golden and so it doesn't have anything to do with the intrinsic value of the comics. However, based on what you're talking about, I'm easy. I work with people. You got two things going for you. I think you touched on something. This is the age of the collector. This is when all those baseball card people say, well, shit, our thing didn't go. Let's go over and see what their thing is about. And they jump in, and the collectors, the collectors, the speculation, if you want to call it, just boomed. It was huge. And so there's two things here that are at play. One, the 80s were just as awesome for independent comics, but they didn't get the notice. So it kind of works the same way the Green Arrow story does to get into the death of Gwen Stacy. But 90s was when Image hit, when Valiant hit, and Dark Horse with Legends. So from 86 to say 2000, 2011 or 2001, excuse me, you could call it the creator age. Collector's age works as well, but that is when people started to discover what people know now, is that if you go and you create your own characters, you have control of them.
See, I like what you're saying there, because I like calling some of these timelines as opposed to the metals, which does have some of that, preloaded preconception, regardless. But I also, what I love what you're doing there, and this is also why I was trying to, what I was also trying to do with me pointing at my signposts, is I think it actually helps the understanding of what's going on in that age. Because if I say golden age, silver age, bronze, it's like, it gives me nothing to work with in terms of what those ages mean, right? But if you say something like, there's this like collector's age, where there's this, it helps actually me to kind of envision more about what happened during there, right? And so like post, 9/11, if we call it the 9/11 age or something, as opposed to a precious metal, it helps kind of put into our minds that of what's going on in that age and what's kind of underpinning some of the movement. And so that's why I like to lean more into those types of descriptors. I understand that, like, for some of it, we're never going to get away from golden and silver ages.
The metals are there to
yeah,
stay.
they're there. Yeah, exactly. I agree, especially for the early ones. But even DC, when we pulled up their ages earlier, they stopped using the metals after
bronze.
at bronze.
That's why I have a different name proposal, since we are also getting away from metals for a lot of things, and since there are almost multiple tiny eras, signposts or whatever, it should really be called the plastic age.
Plastic age. Actually, I think you can make some real argument on that, especially because the other thing that we see happen in the after 85 period, before 85, the black and white revolution started, right? But after 85, it hit hard. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was an absolute phenomenon. You've got Cerebus, you've got the Flaming Carrot, you've got ElfQuest, you've got
the Tick,
and some of those started earlier, but they started getting heat, like international levels of heat with cartoon adaptations and collected editions and international tours and Bone, for crying out, Bone, right? In that after 85 period of time, comics were, they've always been more than superheroes, but more than superheroes started getting press in some of that stuff, and I think that's worth paying attention to as well, as and some of that probably has to do with cartoon and film adaptations. Batman in '89 and in the '90s were full of really horrible comic book adaptations, but they still kept it in the public space, including Hutch's favorite, Steel.
I will also point out how all those cartoons really, really easily sold a whole lot of action figures. So the whole plastic age may not be a bad descriptor there.
Well, and also everybody, you could buy all these event comics at the Walmart wrapped in plastic, so that makes sense to me too.
Then here's
And
what I'm
Pogs.
noticing.
Don't forget
And
Pogs.
plastic is very flexible, so I think Plastic Age is the perfect name for that
Yeah.
era.
But here's what I'm noticing, though, is that the further we talk about this, it seems we've got this whole thing where all of a sudden we've got all these micro companies and even indies popping up and taking the world by storm, and they almost seem to have their own golden age, especially for the ones like Image that still exist. As soon as people start talking about 2000 whatever, and they say that's when everything went to crap, all of a sudden we are back to talking about the big two.
Yep.
So again,
Well,
this is why I talk about the splitting of the timeline. It feels like we need to focus on two very different things that were happening here, where all these micro and indie companies really have their own version of the age that don't, I mean, they may have inspired things, but I don't think they would apply to what the other two were doing.
Well, and I think part of what ends up happening with that too is the speculator crash that happened in the 90s. And
You're
a bunch of, I mean, it wasn't just speculator. There was problems with distribution networks. There were problems with the economy. Shops ended up closing because they had been over leveraged into stuff. Bad business. Comic book nerds aren't necessarily good businessmen. So those are all factors in that too.
But now, when was it that what's his name pulled the scam of renumbering all the Marvel comics?
Do you mean when they did the
when everybody thought that
Heroes
if you had,
Reborn?
yeah, I'm not sure. It was X-Men #1. Everybody thought that, if I have anything number one,
that's Lee.
I'll be a
That's
millionaire
Lee.
later.
That was 92.
Okay.
But that didn't really end things. That was the speculator boom was already going on then.
I don't know if I'd call that a scam.
I wouldn't call it a scam.
It was a bad idea ultimately.
I mean, my understanding is he purposefully did that knowing that it would cause people to buy more comics whether or not they read them.
I would call it a gamble.
Yeah, that's still not a scam.
Yeah. I mean, that was like the black cover, the black plastic sleeve that came on the Death of Superman. I mean, it was a marketing ploy, but I wouldn't call it a scam.
It's a gimmick. You can call it a gimmick. I just wouldn't call it a scam. Yeah.
And they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that people would buy one to rip open, and the collector's mindset takes over. So we would buy one to save and keep mint.
It's a tactic in the same way that Marvel had their tactic of introducing a brand new superhero as issue 178 of something, of mystery something, it's like, because then the people who are buying the comics are like, oh, this has been around for 178 issues. Whereas if you put out Thor #1, they might not buy it. So,
well, that's the difference between now and then in the golden age. If you put out a #1, it was an untested, untrusted title. People wouldn't pay for it. But if you, and that's why you get a lot of stuff like all Western becomes Western Weird Tales, and the numbering continues because it was understood. This is it's a new book, but it starts at 128 or something like that.
Dell's 4-Color Adventures, which had a different title every 2 weeks.
Yeah, try searching. I've been searching for Zorro #1, which is actually 4-Color Comics 1070 whatever.
I think Jim Tuner, who's in the chat, I think one time sent me a message explaining how the numbering system worked, or it was a comment on a video I did. I reviewed a Dell Western comic I picked up somewhere, and he was explaining how it was, and I was just like, and at the time it made a lot of sense, but it did not pierce my conscious mind into my memory. I just read it and said, oh, okay, I understand that now, and then I promptly went to forget it.
Actually Zorro #1 was my most the highest selling comic in my auctions before until Common America.
Oh
yeah, sold one for around $155 around there.
Yeah,
was. I wish I had it back though. There's some books I wish I never sold.
I love that. I love Zorro.
And then Common America comes along, and it's Tim Lim, and it's the rarest of all of them, and it ended up going 2,000.
Yeah. For sure. Okay, so if we agree that the bronze or whatever is the last of the Metal Ages, and that goes till 86 or whatever. And then we have the plastic, the collectors era, the
I like the independent creator era.
Independent creator.
Independent era.
I like that one too. I like that.
That is when like Comico. I'm trying to think of all those like AC Comics, Hero Comics, all of these.
Defiant.
Well, that's in the 90s. I'm talking about the ones that started it off in the 80s.
Yeah.
There's like you talk about James Robinson and Bill, what's his name, that did Fables. Yeah, they were all over Independence. You had the Elementals were huge, DNA agents. So there were a lot, and of course Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That was really when it began. And I think watching the Tick with Ben Enlund, was it? It kind of, I think that really did set a fire under people like Todd McFarlane. We're going, wait a second, I'm doing all this freaking work and I'm getting, I mean, obviously is being paid a lot of money back in the day, but comparative to the ownership of what they had,
I think it is absolutely fair to call that era the rise of the indies, and especially because you get to see back at the main two, you get to see those two theories of comics creation play out, and it led to some levels of chaos in some books, and at the same time you got to see DC in the late 90s. I think Hutch would agree with me on this. They were trying to launch a classic heroic age, right? To really make something that held that mark of the heroic myth stories. And
when exactly are you saying?
In the late 90s.
Yes. Yeah. I would agree with that. Yeah.
In Batman, in the Flash, Mark Waid's Flash is nothing but what is a man, what is a hero? For 3 years of stories, progressively plumbing that well and coming up with just amazing things.
Yeah. It's a little tiny thing, but there was a little mini series called The Silver Age in 2000. And what's notable about it is that it backdated Superman and Batman to be founding members of the Justice League again. And it got rid of what we'd had for like 15 years of, or not, a little less than that, but of them being like, they weren't even friends anymore. And neither of them had ever been in the Justice League. And that was it's hard to have a Justice League that doesn't have Superman and Batman in it. And, Grant Morrison put them in the Justice League, and then this series finally said they're also founding members of the JLA.
Yeah. One of the things about Grant Morrison's Justice League that's during this time period and is playing this thing is Morrison began asking these questions about heroism and building these mythic structures around it.
Yeah.
And at some point in the story, he just shotgunned it. I mean, like he just took it out back and beat it, the hero myth in the head, and then shot it through the belly. And
the second proposal,
and
it would appease the mythological nerd inside of me. In Greek age cycle, the next age after the Bronze Age is the heroic age.
Yeah.
That's actually, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I think that the scholar that I've been referencing a lot here, he does bronze, iron, and then he goes heroic age. And he's mapping things a little differently than we are, but he actually does follow that.
Though it should be the other way around, because if you were mapping to the Greek, I could probably understand why he's doing it his way. But we would currently be in the Iron Age. So the heroic age was the age before us, and then there were 3 ages of like giants before the heroic age in the mythology, which maps to like the golden, silver, bronze, then heroic, then iron.
But again, if you're going to do that, you have got to separate it from the plastic age as literally 2 micro ages, because they're just not doing the same thing.
Well, I think they in some ways are trying to do the same thing, because like McFarland and Larson, they're still working inside the framework. All those Image guys are working inside the framework of hero comics, and it's just their version. It's their edgy teenager version of heroes, right? I mean that's the same thing that so they're still embodying some of those ideals while disembodying or actively embodying the opposite of other of those ideals, but it's still working within that paradigm of trying. And that's why I was thinking it's almost like we've got these two visions of what a superhero universe, what a superhero story ought to be, and they're competing for dollars.
Have you guys ever been a part of TV and or filmmaking?
No.
Okay. At a certain point in time, you got to look at all the stuff you put together, and you got to edit the out of this. Now, there's some great ideas. There's some great ideas and everything, but you want to break this down to the essence, and you want to make it as simple as you can for everybody to consume. Because you and I, especially if you guys are in any way, shape, or form the kind of reader or collector I am, I've been doing this for 47 years now, 48 years. I've been reading comics and collecting comics. If you are, you got to understand, you and all of us can go so deep dive. So ultimately, you got it. I get it. You have this era, and and Image were doing different things than Jeff Smith in the later half of the 90s. But at some point in time, what is the one thing? What is the one theme that travels from 1986, the beginning of this new age that we're trying to come up with, to what we have decided 2001, which will start the next era? But what is the one central theme? And that is what it has to be. If you're not going metal, you have to come up with that one central theme. And what would that be to you?
Ooh, that's such a good question.
It's just so
because all this other stuff is just minutia detail in the in that particular era.
Yeah. No, I agree. That's again why I was trying to point to. Again, I'm not saying that I succeeded, but my attempt was to try and point to some of these huge kind of like shifting things where it's like, and then maybe from there we could do kind of what Englandton is saying, is like try to boil down an essence of like, hey, huge signpost here, huge shift here. Now looking back at that period or decade, a lot of times it seems to hover around 10 to 15 year blocks.
Yeah.
All right. I really hate this, but in art history, the modern age is when everything stopped being about one gigantic movement and split into a million tiny movements. We may just have to bite the bullet and call this the modern age. Especially since even in art history, there is a post and a post-post modern age.
That's true.
Yeah, but artists are they're pretentious.
I agree.
It's true. No, and the thing is, and there's an argument in favor of Cartoonicus's point, is there's also a philosophically modern point. And postmodern.
I like your idea. I think you named it a while back, and everything just got re-argued. The rise of the independents.
Yeah.
I think this is the time. Not to say that Marvel and DC didn't come up with some great stuff, but if there is an overarching theme from 1986 with Aracel Comics and, like I said, Hero Comics, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles leading into in the 90s Image Comics and Dark Horse and all sorts of stuff. It is that the divorce between creator and the big two, that's when it begun.
I think that's also really, really a good point to bring out too, because the other thing that's factored is even in the big two was largely populated by freelancers. Or people that would bounce between companies to tell those stories.
And there were a lot of arguments in the 80s about creator control.
And the idea of that runs that you have where you've got these basically independent creators that are contracted to do this run and the story, and those runs become so. If you were reading comics in the 80s and 90s, the concept of capturing the run of a character or run of a creator on a character, that is the language in which we would speak. So I definitely think that is the idea of the rise of the independents captures kind of all of those movements in there in a way that really does make it understandable to somebody walking in.
And the direct markets also, like, again, it maps a bit there because you have the direct market rise.
Right. The tip of the cap to R. Crumb in the 70s.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of those comics are the next guys that paved the way, but it became the way here after 85, 86. Yeah, I think that's,
as far as, so that's, we're talking about the 90s and all that, and where to cut off, and make the transition. And this is a funny thing worth bringing up. You're talking about like all the arguments about creative control. And, I talked about how Dan DiDio taking over at DC and, Jeanette Kahn and Paul Levitz leaving. There was a big editorial shift there too at the same time. And a lot of the creators that we knew kind of left and new people came in right around that time too. But a big thing is, and Chuck Dixon's talked about this on his show, is when Chuck came back from CrossGen for a short time and worked at DC, he's writing his books and finding that because things are done on computer, they can just go and re-edit the story after you've turned it in and done it. And this is a big thing with Dan DiDio, is he'll rewrite a book after it's like, we wrote the book. And it's like, no, well, I don't like this. And he moves things around and changes it. Chuck talked about that. And when I talked with Mark Waid about 52, you remember the weekly thing came up? Yeah. Because, of course, big concern to me, because I'm one of the biggest Elongated Man fans in the world. I would say the biggest, except Mark Waid himself said, no, you're not. So I'd
pay-per-view that fight.
Oh, he'd win.
Mark Waid knows his shit, whether you like him or not.
That's right.
Him and Kurt Busiek, you can hate them all you want. They know their shit.
No, that's fine. I was just going to say, Mark Waid couldn't win a single fight if it was an actual fist
fight. I thought you meant a debate. I didn't know you were talking about fight. Yeah.
Right. But I was asking about issue 42, which was the death of Elongated Man, and I said, since I thought he was the one handling the Elongated Man plot line, and along with a couple other plot lines in there, they split it between 4 writers. And I said it didn't make sense to me, because if Ralph is such a brainy guy, why does he engineer this situation where they kill him? And then that's just it. Why did he do this? It doesn't make sense, because then he's gone to all this work, putting all this magic together, doing all these spells. My idea was that they kill him, and then Neron and Faust realize they're trapped in this tower, and the only person who could release them is Ralph, so they have to bring him back. And his deal, now he has power over them, is you have to bring my wife back. And so I'm starting to tell him this. I didn't even get that far into the theory, and he's like, "What was published was not what I wrote." And he was gonna, and he offered to show me his real script, but when I emailed him, he did email me back. So he said, "Just email me." And I thought, okay, but I never heard back from him. But I would have kept quiet about it. I'd have kept it to myself. But I'm dying of curiosity to know what it was. But there's so many. I've heard this from so many people that Dan DiDio wants to edit things, and he even trashed 52 and said that the next one, Countdown, was going to be doing 52 properly. I mean, he's bashing them in public, saying that was a mess. That was a terrible one. Well, 52 is much better than
really
Countdown.
Is. It's like I remember reading a Wizard magazine where they talked about how somebody described Sleepwalker as the Sandman done right.
Oh.
You do you, man.
Yeah.
You sound like a happy person.
Yeah.
I'm detecting a theme that you don't like Dan DiDio.
The funny thing is, he loves Metal Men, and he's really good at the Metal Men. He and I would be like simpatico with the Metal Men, but everything else is garbage.
You know what, dude? If you had paid attention, I was really trying to steer us towards like every era named after one of the Metal Men. I think that would be awesome. Like this era is 10 because it's paper thin and
really, I'd say it's the Nameless era.
Yeah.
There you go.
So that'd have been really funny if we'd gone Metal Men on it, but it's too late now. So if we agree that we have the rise of the indies being that 85, 86-ish to what do we think is an end date when the indie control stopped being what's driving comics?
Well, so and then that's what I was gonna ask.
So do you want these ones to be back to back, no gap in between, or?
I'm thinking they almost have to be because so many of those things kind of, I mean, because a lot of it is the like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles predates that, Cerebus predates that. I think.
I wouldn't put Cerebus in because we are largely talking about superhero comics. I wouldn't put Cerebus
right,
in
but
with
yeah,
that.
I mean,
Cerebus was very much of its time, but who thinks of it now?
Yeah,
I'd put Turtles in there. Turtles count, I think, as if not superheroes, so close to superheroes they might as well be.
Right. I mean,
so
that's
I'm fine with putting them in there.
There's certain things that like blur the lines. Like we're talking about Warlord and how Sword and Sorcery comics had such an impact in the way superhero stories are being told. I think that there are some that are adjacent to superheroes enough that they still impact the way superhero stories are being told. But
I love Bone, but I wouldn't put it in with the superhero books.
Well,
it is a hero story, though.
Yeah.
It is 100% a hero story.
No,
it's a hero story. It's just not a superhero.
Like Conan.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yes, I compared Bone to Conan.
Stupid rat creatures.
It's a great story, isn't it? It's one of the best of the 90s.
That's
It's one of the best of all time.
I would agree. I would agree with that entirely.
It's up there. It's definitely up there. No, that's great.
It's a long list. The greatest of all time is a long list. But Bone.
Do you want to know? Do you want to know who has shade to throw at Bone and it totally took me off guard?
Who?
Matt Krotz.
Oh my gosh! What?
We were having a.
We'll have to talk about this after the stream. There's too much. Too much right now.
What?
No, Matt. We have a comic creator friend named Matt Krotz.
Yeah.
Krotz. And
that's his new nickname, by the way. No, Hutch is onto something. His new nickname is Matt
that's
Crotch.
a good nickname.
Oh
I actually thought you said Matt Crotch.
That's what they're calling him now because of the crotch shot he took of us at Tampa.
That's cool.
Never mind.
Okay, there's so much to discuss after the stream. But back to the ages of comics. Okay.
Okay.
But we decide. I think I like the idea because once again, 2000s was just such a time for comics. Obviously, it got worse, but 2000s really kind of kicked that off. I think 9/11. I think you nailed something. 9/11 affected the writers, which affected the comic book industry.
Big time. Yep.
So I think 9/11, 2001. You could say that's the
I
beginning
feel like
of the
there's
next
something
era.
else that has to be questioned, though. And that is because if we're going to do this, we're going to define this last age entirely by the indies. Indies never stopped existing after that, right?
No.
So
yeah, but that's when they became more than what they were. Even though, yes, you had the success of Dell Comics and you had the success for a while anyway of stuff like Fawcett.
Right.
And there were hardly any more indie comics than there ever was during the Golden Age.
So the question is, why do we, as soon as everything goes to crap here, why is it we're suddenly back to specifically focusing on Marvel and DC?
But it wasn't just Marvel and DC.
Well, yeah,
even in the independent comics, you have Robert Kirkland writing about Apocalypse, writing a story about how Superman is evil. You have a darker outlook in even the independent comics starting in the 2000s.
Well, and I think one of the big reasons that we go back to talking about Marvel and DC after 2001 is because all of the big moving and shaking was being done by DC, because the speculator crash in the late 90s killed so much of the market.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That there wasn't enough air in the room to go around, and tons of indie companies went completely belly up. Valiant stopped existing. Malibu had already been purchased and dissolved. Friggin' Dark Horse was barely able to squeak through. And they, the only reason they did is because they were making Star Wars comics that you would not believe.
So in a way, would you say this is the re-rise of the big two? And does that have an effect on this?
No, I wouldn't call it that, because like it's not like they went to the big two have always been there. It's the fact that during that point that England's bringing up, there was this meteoric shift, not even shift, a rise of them, and it's important to kind of mark that. And there was a bunch of them for a time, but their heyday was never as big as when that was.
Right, but we've got
So-
to figure out why things went so bad.
And
so
something-
I'm trying to figure out if there are connections here.
No, I don't think that independent comic books, in all honesty, except for The Walking Dead, were really culturally relevant in the 2000s. And when it comes to comics, whether you're an independent fan or not, Marvel and DC, what they do matters far more. And let's just take the last few years. What Marvel did, good or bad, with Ms. Marvel, Moon Girl, all the stuff that you could, oh, it's woke shit and I hate it. That has far more relevancy than the excellent shirtless bear fighter. A great freaking independent, but a lot of people didn't even know there was a title called the shirtless bear fighter until I just mentioned it right now.
Yeah,
and that's the way independent comics are. Occasionally something jumps up and says, hey, look at me. But for the most part, it is Marvel and DC. But the rise of the independents, what we're talking about is that was when you had the Eastman and Laird, you had the Ben Inlands, you had Image Comics. And that's why that goes. But they can't be the great newbie independent comic book creators at all time. So it peters off. What is next? And that, like I said, I think y'all nailed something by saying it's 9/11.
Well, and one of the other things that I want to point out, I'm sorry, let me finish this up quick. I'll get back to you. One of the things I also want to point out is in terms of DC and their heroic renaissance in the late 90s, two of their best quality books, Sandman and Starman, were written like indie books, and the creators own big chunks of those pieces. You don't get to play with Jack Knight without getting written permission from James Robinson. You don't get to talk about the Endless, with the exception of Destiny, without talking to Neil Gaiman, right? Gaiman, whatever. I've never gotten his name right. But which is shameful, fine. But that indie spirit still has an effect on the big two. We don't see that happening with any kind of staying power after 9/11. Even though we've got people with creator-owned books being published by the main two, they're not successful for the most part. Which is a shame, because The Silencer was a great book. I
think
loved
there's
it.
another big thing that started happening in the aughts, which doesn't pertain to our eras or timeline, but does affect the American timeline. And there was something internationally that started becoming readily available here in the States that really, really hurt American comics.
Yeah.
And that was cheap, thick collections of manga, because even the previous people like Dark Horse and stuff that were bringing manga here, you had to pay basically full comic price for that, issue by issue. But when Viz starts bringing the tankobon over here in the aughts, you can get that for like $10 a book, and you've got 200 pages there. And it is just killing, because poor kids can go to their Barnes & Noble and they can buy a full volume of the same thing they just saw on TV on like Kids WB the morning before.
All right, but
And they're available in the mass market.
I gotta squash this because
really?
No, Metal's completely right. What I'm saying is I gotta squash the manga interjection into this timeline, because this is a superhero timeline.
Well,
and
no,
if we're
I'm
using...
not bringing it into the timeline. I'm just saying that, that
right.
affects the sales and the trajectory of superhero comic books. Like,
Okay,
we're not,
I'll agree with that.
Actually,
yeah.
The Metal has a point, because also at the same time, you have Grant Morrison jumping on JLA, and he's writing for trade paperbacks. If you look at the storylines, everything is 4 to 6 issues, with exception, of course. And then that leads into the Ultimate Universe for Marvel, and you've got Brian Michael Bendis, you've got Mark Millar, and they're writing their titles 4 trade paperbacks. So it's all this 6-issue story, whether or not you needed the 6 issues, which is what makes Grant Morrison's Justice League superior.
Yeah.
He
And
knew when to end a story. Yeah.
As
But
an
actually,
explanation
this
for
might
why
be
a
the
lot
trade
of
error. I'm sorry, Metal. What were you saying?
Yeah. Well, I'm bringing this up as also an explanation for why the indies as a whole stop having cultural relevance, because if you weren't Marvel or DC, it was already hard enough to compete against the manga that were now available in Barnes & Noble. I knew nobody in like middle school and high school when I was there, which would have been this era, who was reading independent books. They were barely even reading Marvel or DC. So if you were part of like the bigger companies, you weren't getting read. There's no way you had sticking power, with like the exception of like The Walking Dead, or might have had like Scott Pilgrim was
Invincible.
big, but it's not really a superhero comic, you know.
Yeah.
So
I think Invincible fits in there too. And one of the things about this too is the other thing is the indie books don't have the sales numbers to justify the spot on a Barnes and Noble shelf.
Yeah.
So you've got a few comics that don't fit into the superhero mold that are gonna have some time up there just because they're Mariko Tamaki's sisters, Super Mutant Magic Academy, a few memoir kind of comics that are just in constant rotation. But for the most part, your indie comics and your indie hero comics especially do not move the numbers to justify going the trade route and into the new market that at this point we're looking at is Barnes and Noble, because the newsstand is dying. Things
right.
Diamond is going. People are going exclusive with Diamond. Marvel had tried to do their own distribution a few years before this and had burnt really badly. Some of the other syndicates had folded and coalesced, and Diamond came out the winner about here in the timeline. And so you're looking at that the market's shifting drastically in the early 2000s.
Yeah, and Englandton bringing up the trade paperbacks is like those do very well in Barnes & Noble. And Barnes & Noble is like the main market during this time. People would even rather go there than a comic book shop.
Mm-hmm.
I hate
and
to be
there's
that
more
guy,
of them.
but we're at the 2 hours.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, but so to summarize, manga killed indie, 9/11 killed the big two, and they have nothing to do with each other.
Well,
Right?
I think
Can we say that?
unfortunately
I don't know if I'd phrase it like that.
unfortunately we don't have time to figure out what that means. And I don't know whether there is enough meat on the bone for a whole nother show. Are we interested in doing another one to discuss the last 20 years?
I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
We could say that this leads into 213, where you have Marvel now. You have not the 52 going in, and from there, I think what was You Lousy Kids and I have both
Just
labeled it a crap era.
Yeah. Yeah, the era of crap.
The era
I'm
of
probably saying
crap
we're
is
currently in the dark ages.
I think so.
I'm gonna push back against that a little bit, but I think just because I don't know if I would go as far. I'm clearly I have a lot of agreement and concurrence with there being a lot of crap, but not enough for me to call it like age of crap. Because
you did have the early years of the Rebirth before Bendis.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and I think one of the things you also have to realize is like we're in the middle of a thing. There is no way of knowing where things are going to go now.
Yeah, you can't call an age until you're like 10 years or so afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm barely even reading big two books, right? So I'm keeping up on one title right now. So it's one of those things where we may need we know by 2012 everything is awful. But what happened after that?
Well,
I'm not
that's
sure.
We're currently in a dark age, because dark also means unknown. We don't know.
There you go.
Right now.
I want to point out, I feel like there's been at least one more big indie revolution that may even still be going on right now.
We'll see.
That's for next time.
Maybe next time. So anyway, this has been fun, guys. Thank you for coming on and talking about it, Englandine. Appreciate that. I know you got here late for Hutch. Thanks for making the time.
Sure.
And you other three, you're kind of regulars, and I like having you around, but I'm used to you, so I'm all.
Welcome
You
back,
know what they
Twitless.
say? Familiarity breeds well contempt. But
Yeah, contempt. I don't feel contemptuous. I feel
Before you go, do you mind if I bring up something? Because you mentioned this when we were talking about the Bronze Age and all that kind of stuff. I would recommend books like this. This is the Comic Book Implosion, and it talks all about that era. It talks everything that happened. There's another book called Slugfest, the Marvel biography. I'm going through Joe Simon right now. There are so many books about comics, not just of comics, like a trade paperback or something. And I would highly recommend almost all of them, because this is an amazing hobby with a great history, and it's worth knowing.
Cool.
I'm just noticing your note here. Twitless killed the Bronze Age.
Because I was born in '86, and that's Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, same year.
It's the year we decided on, so.
Oh, that's
So we also have 9/11 killed comics, which
right.
Just period.
So maybe there is no third stream.
So
Yeah, no. We're Victor von Frankenstein here. We're trying to like resurrect it with lightning.
Right.
yeah. Well, I mean, comics is an idea, and you can't kill an idea. But, and I think it's also worth. Well, I could keep going. I could keep talking. We can't do that. We gotta call it. Before we do, does anybody have anything they want to pitch out to the world to say? Look at the things I'm doing.
Check out Omega Girl. I am on issue 4, and issue 4 should be coming out fairly soon. I just got proof copies. It looks really good, like the best I've ever done so far.
I
still need to read issue 3.
On I Love Comics, every Saturday night at 8:00, I do a comic book auction. The auction is there it's a cheaper one. It's not one of these everything's a slab. Fill out your collection, try something new. I also have a channel called From the Long Box. It's lesser known, but that's where I only talk about comics. And I've been doing Jack Kirby month. I'm about to record the first appearance of Devil Dinosaur. I might actually finish out the story. And the Blue Beetles. So a lot of fun.
Cool. Also, a little slide note, I will point out, having purchased on the auction over there, that excellent service. Highly recommend.
You, sir.
Yes.
I appreciate it. It's good to have somebody call out the legitimacy. Yeah.
Real books delivered to your house.
Hopefully protected enough.
Yeah. Mine came
That's
great.
the main thing.
So
and on my channel at You Lousy Kids on YouTube, I stream every day 4 to 6 p.m. Central Time, playing Legend of Zelda, and I just upload. I'm starting to put together little edited versions so you don't have to watch a 2-hour video if you want. I put together a 20-second video of one of the funniest things that's happened to me so far, so go check it out if you want. I'm not even going to describe it. I couldn't describe it if I tried. So
I am intrigued. The Metal, what are you up to these days?
Oh, everything. Very lately, I actually yesterday streamed for like 9 hours straight, but over on the Vomitorium, I wouldn't say straight, I took a couple breaks, but on the Vomitorium, I do our semi-weekly news show, and then after that, I streamed video games, mostly gacha games, Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail for hours on end. But also, I need money, and you need art, so if you have commission work that you need, contact me, and I will get it to you.
That's amazing.
Later.
Oh, do you have anything else to say?
No, actually,
you need art.
I need art.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
I love this. I, of course, do this show every week. Next week, I have no idea what we're talking about yet. But Twitless will be back, probably. So that's cool. But the other thing is we are finally dropping another page for Forces Senior Year. Will be available Friday morning on our webtoon out there. If you're a Patreon member, you've already seen it. Patreon.com/idealcomics. And also in September, if any of you guys are in Western Nebraska out there in the world, free Minicon on the 23rd. down here at our local mall, and I'm gonna be there. Barry's gonna be there. Some other folks, some folks coming up from Denver. Actually, really exciting. And we'll have a list over on our Facebook as people sign up for that. So that's the story. So yeah. You look at Ideal Comics on Facebook, and you can get a link to the Mini Cons Facebook page, all that kind of stuff. Until then, guys, out there in the world, get out there and read some comics. Oh, before we go, one last thing. In the Ideal Comics Discord, the subject of Road to Perdition came up, and I did find my mass market trade paperback of Road to Perdition. It's smaller sized, and it was $14. So there you go. That's my question. I think I actually got it at Walmart, so I got paid like $11. That's a show. Go out and read Road to Perdition. It's flipping amazing. Max Allen Collins. Come on. Later.